There we go. And we're off. First of all, we're going to be setting the scene. I'm going to try to keep these to an hour. We're already 15 minutes in. This particular class is about 90 minutes, so I apologize for that. The others won't be quite as long. So, Eretz Israel, E-R-E-T-Z, Eretz Israel, which is the land that was, according to the Bible, promised by God to Abraham as the permanent home of the Jewish people. It has been one of the main military thoroughfares as far back as written records. In fact, the first coherent account of any military campaign to come down to us is held by a lot of scholars to be a narrative of an Egyptian invasion of Canaan. And this narrative happens to be an inscription that was discovered on the tomb of Uni, U-N-I, who was one of Pharaoh Pepi I's generals in the Egyptian army. And what he does on his tomb, he brags about the conquest of, quote, the land of the dwellers of the sand in a combined sea and land operation. Uni's seaborne troops effected an amphibious landing behind the Gazelle Nose Ridge, and he overcame the enemies even before the Egyptian complement that was marching up from the south along the coastal plain ever reached the battlefield, though the mere threat of this approach towards the enemy's rear probably helped him win that battle. The time was 24th century BC, 2,400 years before the birth of Christ, and the land of the sand dwellers is present-day Israel. And the Gazelle Nose Ridge may have been the Carmel Promontory, and I'll show you where that is on the map later on. Before we go into any details, though, a few words about nomenclature. As mentioned, Eretz Israel is the Hebrew name for the Holy Land, while Canaan was the name of this whole area, the name it was known by prior to the Israelite conquest of the area. After the split of the United Monarchy, which was in 925 BC, the northern kingdom retained the name of Israel, while the southern kingdom changed their name to Judah. If you looked at the timeline I sent out in a previous email, you notice in there about the United Monarchy and then the split. This very much, our own history follows that same pattern. If you think about it, the Pilgrims came here and trying to escape persecution because they wanted religious freedom. Same was with Abraham. Abraham left Mesopotamia looking for religious freedom, and the land was promised to his descendants by God. It wasn't promised to him, it was promised to his descendants. Well, about 1,000 years later, it did come to be. But when it did, it was just 12 kind of loosely configured tribes, 12 tribes, basically running their own thing. They didn't really have a central leader. Just like here in the United States, we had 13 colonies. But eventually our 13 colonies came together to be the United States of America. The same thing happened. The 12 tribes decided to combine into a united monarchy or into a single ruler. And that lasted for a while, but then there was a split. And they split north and south. Sound familiar? And the north retained the name of Israel. Just like when our country split, the north retained the name of United States of America, whereas the south changed their name to Judah. Eventually, the term Judah was used to designate all of the Jewish dominions after they returned from exile from Babylon in 537 BC, some 400 years after the split. When the United Monarchy split, it was sort of easier to pick them off. Israel fell, and then sometime later Judah fell, and all of the Jews that were there were exiled to Babylon. And eventually, though, they were able to come back. And when they did, the whole area just sort of became known at that point as Judah. Now, the Latinized term for that is Judea, and that name was later given to the whole country as a Roman province after Vespasian and Titus conquered the area. And then later on, this name was changed to Syria Palestina, hence Palestine, by the Emperor Hadrian in his attempt to stamp out the Jews in their homeland after the Great Revolt under Bar Kokhba in 132 to 135 AD. And then throughout all of its subsequent history, the country has continued to be known as Palestine, because even though the Arabs controlled it at one time and the Turks controlled it at one time, neither of them decided to give it their own name. They just left it as Palestine. So I'll use the term Palestine whenever we're talking about the country in a geographical sense within its geographical borders, without any reference to whatever political activity is going on at any given time. So Palestine is about the land itself. Also, the Jordan River kind of splits the country north and south. Everything to the west of the Jordan is often referred to as Cisjordan, C-I-S. Cisjordan is to the west. If you cross over the Jordan to the east, that's referred to as Transjordan. And again, that's in the geographic sense. So we'll use those terms occasionally, Cisjordan and Transjordan, talking about the geography. I wanted to share this map. There we go. This map shows the modern borders. You can see Israel's located right here. First and foremost, of the geopolitical properties that have always governed the fate of the Holy Land is its position. The country is the sole land bridge that connects Europe up here and Asia and Africa. There is no detour between the sea and the desert. And there's no alternative but to pass along the Palestinian roads that run north and south. Some of them on the west side of the Jordan, Cisjordan, some of them along the eastern or the eastern side of the Jordan, which would be Transjordan. So consequently, the powers of the day usually didn't refrain even from armed conflict to seize and hold this strategic area, which has proved itself absolutely indispensable, both for the flow of commerce in peacetime and for the movement of armies in wartime. So any nation aspiring to establish an independent national state on the Palestinian land bridge had to accept a primary fact of life. It was destined to live under constant concentric pressure from near and from far, and only constant military preparedness would guarantee its survival. So it's probably no coincidence that the only people to create a national commonwealth on the Palestinian land bridge that lasted, except for some short interruptions, any appreciable time at all, and we're talking 12 centuries, basically from the 12th century BC onwards, was the Jewish people. Now, the very smallness of the country sets automatic, definite limits on its population. And back in the ancient period, when agriculture was extensive and only a small portion of society were able to live by occupations other than farming, there was one major means for augmenting the national potential in manpower and food production. Any guesses at what that might be? It was the conquest of foreign territory. That's the only way you could do it. By acquiring more arable land and sufficient tillers of the soil, a ruler could allocate a higher portion of his own people to be either temporarily or permanently marshaled for wartime. What I'd like to do now is, one of the things I'm going to be doing is sharing a couple of videos, and I wanted to share one with you now. A little word about the videos. Some of them are a little bit preachy, but they're very, very, very informative. And where are we here? share. There we go. They're very informative. So I think you're really going to like the videos. Also, in a couple of the videos, there was a large group of high school kids who were apparently taking a tour of the Holy Land when these videos were being made. So they were used in a lot of these videos, and it's kind of cute. And in fact, there's even outtakes, which you'll find interesting. So here's the first video. I'm starting at about 2 minutes in.
Map 12.1 in the Satellite Bible Atlas shows the
Everybody
borders
hear
of
it.
the modern countries in the Middle East. Let's take a closer look at Israel's position as a land bridge between three continents. Note the two ancient cradles of civilization, Mesopotamia and Egypt. The route between Mesopotamia and Egypt is funneled through the land of Israel because the Arabian Desert to the east and the Mediterranean Sea in the west present difficult obstacles for travel. As a land bridge between continents, the land of Israel has historically been coveted by big empires in Egypt and Asia. Any kingdom interested in expanding military, economic, political interests would set its sights on Israel as a bridge for expansion. Later in history, Europe got into the picture. This is a well-chosen land for the Lord of the earth to demonstrate in sometimes subtle, yet concrete ways, his sovereignty over the kingdoms of men. The history of the Jewish people, with the land of Israel, is evidence that the God of the Bible is the true God who alone transcends time and space. Before we look closer at the land of Israel, there are a few other features and terms of the ancient Near East to be familiar with. We will use map 2.1, a map showing Abram's migration from Mesopotamia to Canaan, to mark out the Fertile Crescent. This is an area shaped like a crescent that extends from the Persian Gulf north along the Tigris and Euphrates river basins through modern Syria, and then down along the eastern Mediterranean seaboard. It is a land with enough water, either from rivers or rain, to produce crops. The Fertile Crescent is made up of two parts. Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris. This is where Iraq is today, and in ancient times was the center of both the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. The other part of the Fertile Crescent is called the Levant, which is the eastern Mediterranean seaboard. Levant means raised up. The area is characterized by hills and valleys, plateaus and mountains, some over 9,000 feet in elevation. The Levant includes the land of Israel, which was called Canaan in Abraham's time. To briefly review the main concepts presented in this video, the land of the Bible is a real place on our earth. The Bible describes real people, real events, and real places. The Bible is a record of God's involvement with the real world of mankind. Next, the land of the Bible is situated as a land bridge between three continents. Empires in Asia, Africa, and Europe have coveted this land as a bridge for expansion. We mentioned that the central position of the land and people of Israel ultimately testifies to the transcendence and sovereignty of the God of the Bible. We also learned the location of the Fertile Crescent, including its two parts, Mesopotamia and the Levant. In our next video, we will take a closer look at the distinctive geographical regions of the land of Israel.
Okay. There. Even after the conquest of the Central Mountain Massif, and even after expanding south down into the Negev Desert, which is located here, still the Palestinians were numerically small compared to the other large nations and populations down in Egypt and up in Eurasia. So they were still relatively small. The next geopolitical factor that is evident from UNI's campaign is that Palestine is endowed with both an extended shoreline and long land borders, which impose upon any nation that's trying to dominate the country the double task of both land and sea defense. one of the basic decisions that the makers of Palestinian national defense policy has always been what portion of the national potential to allocate to each. And from this series of talks, it's going to become evident that the Jews of antiquity found this double task beyond their capability. And they tried to solve their naval commitments largely by alliances, treaties, coercion, but with the sea people. Up here to the north, the Mediterranean Sea people were the Phoenicians. And then down here to the south, the Mediterranean Sea peoples were the Philistines. And this kind of arrangement isn't all that great because at the very time when Israel needed their naval commitments to live by their treaties or whatever the most is when they were under stress, when they needed that maritime trade for commerce and they needed that naval support in wartime. That's when they would suddenly become lukewarm or even sever their relationships altogether. Now, this area you see in green is the area that's described in the Bible, in the book of Numbers, as the land of Canaan. All of that green space. In fact, I believe it's, I have to go back and look, but I believe it's chapter 1 that describes in very detail the southern border in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, and I think verses 3 or 4 describe the western border, which is basically the shoreline. And then the next few verses describe the northern border, and then the last few verses describe the eastern border. But the land proper is basically from the ladder of Tyre, which is located here, all the way down to the brook of Egypt, or Wadi El Ari. A wadi is what they refer to as a river. And this is either the brook of Egypt or Wadi El Arish. El Arish is the name of a major city that's located right there on the border. And that's about 155 miles as the crow flies. And then from Dan, which is located about here, it's not shown in this map, all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba is about 255 miles. Let's see here. The next geopolitical factor that governs the Palestinian land bridge is the country is on the border between the desert and the arable land. Its southern border and its eastern borders have always been wide open to raids and invasions, and people trying to come in and take control of land to increase their grazing lands, if you will. And the ancient Israelites were very keen on this. Why? Because they themselves conquered the land by invading it from the deserts in the east. So they were very conscious that that's always going to be a problem. Palestine is divided lengthwise, north and south, by the Jordan Rift Valley. The Jordan Rift Valley all the way down to the Dead Sea, here it's referred to as the Salt Sea, is the lowest point on the globe. It has an average temperature of 77 degrees. And then right up here, you see Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is snow-capped year-round. Hard to believe. So that armies that were fighting in ancient Egypt obviously had to be versed in diverse aspects of warfare, from mountaineering on one extreme to desert fighting on the other extreme. And a good example of this diversity in the Palestinian theater war, though from a much more recent time, was the Battle of Hattin, which occurred in 1178 AD, when the Crusaders were dying basically from thirst as they were descending from Tiberias down to Galilee. The Saracen commanders were drinking drinks that were cooled by ice brought down by camel relay from Mount Hermon, only 55 miles away. Topographically, the west of the Jordan, or Cisjordan, here's the Jordan River here, the area to the west, Cisjordan, is divided into 5 major zones. You have the coastal plain here, You had the Negev, which is a desert here. You have the Central Mountain Massif, which encompasses this part here, which is the mountains of Judah and the mountains of Ephraim and Samaria. You have Galilee located here. You have the Jordan Rift Valley here, which is the connecting link to Transjordan. This is the Transjordan Plateau located here. There are also two great east-west valleys that divide the highlands into three components. You have the Beersheba Valley right through here, which divides the Negev Desert from the Judean mountains and the hill country. And then it's not depicted on this map, but right here you have the Jezreel Valley, which divides the central mountains of Samaria with the mountains of Galilee. Okay. Time for another video.
This video introduces the basic geography and regions of the land of Israel. We noted in the previous video that the land of Israel is relatively small. It is about the same size as the state of New Jersey, the fifth smallest state in the United States. On map 1.1 in the Satellite Bible Atlas, note that the heartland of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, is only 150 miles long. From Jaffa on the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan River is only 45 miles. However, in this small land, there is great geographical variety. One region varies significantly from another, even though the regions are only a few miles apart. Map 12.3, the last map in the Satellite Bible Atlas, shows the various regions of the land outlined schematically. Each shape or outline shows a different region. Look how even the area of Judah in the south breaks down into 7 very distinct regions. The coastal plain, the Shephelah or foothills, the hill country, the Judean wilderness, the Dead Sea, the Negev or dry basin, and the wilderness highlands. This regional diversity has its effect on both biblical and modern history. The land's history has tended to be characterized by different ethnic groups who maintain independent political rule in different geographical regions. Peace and unity between all groups is seldom, if ever, realized. Here we are taught that real peace is obtained only when God rules men's hearts. As an historical example of the geographical and ethnic diversity in the land, note map 4.2, which shows the area that Israel was and was not able to conquer and settle in the days of Joshua and then afterwards in the time of the Judges. Israel was able to settle in large sections of Transjordan here, and all the way up into Bashan, and also in the hill country, and parts of the hill country in Galilee. But Israel was not able to settle in the coastal plain, or in the Jezreel Valley, or north of the Sea of Galilee.
Let me pause the video here. The yellowish outline is a little hard to see in this map, but I think you can follow it. But what it shows is everything that's in yellow is what the ancient Israelites were able to conquer and control. And all of this other area, particularly the coastal plain, the Valley of Jezreel, and this narrow strip along the Jordan Rift Valley, directly north from the Sea of Galilee, they were never ever really able to control that area. Also depicted on this map are the 12 tribes. This is how the land was divided by Joshua. This is the tribe of Simeon, Judah, Reuben, Benjamin. Dan was here and up here. Ephraim, Gad, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali. These were the 12 tribes. And that's how the land was divided among them. Now up here, this is Gilead here. All the way up here is Bashan. Bashan is the ancient name of what is today known as the Golan Heights. So when you hear the term the Golan Heights, now you know where it is. It's basically directly east of the Sea of Galilee.
Let's see some of the regional and geographical variety in this small land.
Well, here we are in the land of Israel, and in fact, contrary to common belief, most of it is not a desert.
We're in the hill country of Judah, which you can see is very forested, and we're near the biblical site of Kiryat Yearim,
Which means village of the forest.
The variety in Israel includes everything from lush green and waterfalls near Mount Hermon, the well-watered districts around the Sea of Galilee, agriculturally rich plains like the Jezreel Valley, the rugged hill country of Judah near Jerusalem. This hilltop is the ancient town of Kiryat Yearim, just mentioned by the gal in the video. The Ark of the Covenant stayed here for 20 years before Samuel led a national repentance. Later, David brought the Ark from here into Jerusalem. Here's the modern road leading into Jerusalem. And yes, deserts, like the rocky terrain of the Judean wilderness between Jerusalem and Jericho. On map 115, let's mark out the 4 major longitudinal zones, or zones that basically run north-south, that make up the land of the Bible. These zones subdivide into smaller regions, as we will see later, but a basic understanding of the regions of the land of the Bible starts with these 4 zones. First is the coastal plain, a strip of agriculturally productive land, some 8 to 12 miles wide, that runs parallel to the Mediterranean Sea coast. This region tended to have an international aspect to it, since big empires, traveling between Mesopotamia and Egypt, wanted it. The Philistines settled here. Ancient Israel was seldom able to control it. Next is the hill country. Jerusalem, number 15 on this map, sits on the watershed of the hill country at some 2,400 to 2,800 feet above sea level. The hill country is rough terrain of deep valleys and high ridges. It extends north and includes Mount Carmel, which juts out into the Mediterranean Sea, and Galilee. Note here a break in the hill country, which separates the hill country of Judah and Ephraim from Galilee in the north. The break is a wide plain, the triangular or arrowhead-shaped Jezreel Valley. The third north-south zone is the Rift Valley. This is part of the longest rift on the surface of the earth, the Great Syro-African Rift, that runs from Turkey to Kenya. Here, the Rift Valley is a 10-mile wide plain or trench, which separates the hill country here in the west from the high Transjordan Plateau in the east. Much of the Rift Valley in Israel is below sea level. The surface of the Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. The Jordan River descends another 650 feet to the lowest spot on the earth, the Dead Sea. The surface of the Dead Sea is 1,350 feet below sea level. The unique depth of the Rift Valley, especially around the Dead Sea, is one reason there's so much geographical variety in this area. The Dead Sea is only 15 miles from Jerusalem, but is a totally different geographical zone. The fourth major longitudinal zone is the Transjordan Plateau. It can reach over 3,000 feet in elevation and includes the areas around ancient Moab, a plateau, Gilead, and Bashan, all the way up to Mount Hermon. There they are, the 4 major longitudinal zones of the land of the Bible: coastal plain, the hill country, the Rift Valley, and the Transjordan Plateau. Another important feature of the geography of the land of the Bible is rainfall. Believe it or not, Jerusalem receives as much rainfall as London, between 22 to 24 inches each year. The difference is that Israel's rainfall comes in about 5 months, between November and March, with the wettest months being in January and February. So, when it rains, it can pour. Rainfall in Israel varies greatly from region to region. This is especially because the Rift Valley is in the rain shadow of the hill country. Note on this cross-section diagram how most of the rain falls on the western side of the hill country watershed. Jerusalem sits here on the watershed. But east of Jerusalem, there is a severe drop in elevation into the Rift Valley. The clouds dissipate, and less rain falls the further one descends toward the Dead Sea. As mentioned, Jerusalem can get 24 inches of rain a year, but only 15 miles away, Jericho in the Rift Valley, near the Dead Sea, gets only 4 inches of rain per year. This variance in rainfall from region to region contributes to great geographical variety in the land.
Again, I'll pause there. Does anybody find that fact just totally astounding? I mean, that would be like Independence gets an average rainfall of 24 inches a year, while Rehoboth Beach gets only 4 inches of rain a year. Only 15 miles away. Unbelievable.
Let's see a winter rainfall in the hill country of Judah near Jerusalem. Israel has no major river that grants a continuous supply of water. Rather, as Deuteronomy 11:11 says, it is a land dependent on God's yearly provision that drinks rain from heaven. To review, the heartland of the land of Israel is only 150 by 45 miles. Yet this small land contains great geographical variety. The geographical variety has put its stamp on the land's history. We learned about the 4 major longitudinal or north-south running zones of the land of the Bible: the coastal plain, the hill country, the Rift Valley, and the Transjordan Plateau. Finally, we noted that Jerusalem receives as much rainfall as London, some 24 inches a year. However, rain falls only in the winter months, so the land of the Bible experiences long, dry summers. Without the winter rains, life quickly ceases. The writers of Scripture make it clear that man is dependent upon God to send life-giving rain.
Well, we're here in Israel, and there's a lot of variety in the land. In fact, most of it's not a desert.
Yeah, I think those kids are kind of cute. Oh, Lord. Let's see here. Where's the next one? Oh, here we go. Okay. Everybody see that?
Mm-hmm.
Did I share a map? Okay. Just to point out very quickly, if you look down here, here's the town of Ur. But if you look up here, here's another town called Ur. Now, which one of these Urs, Abram, who later changed his name to Abraham, which one of those towns he left, nobody really knows for sure which is the correct one. But they do know he arrived at Haran, and this is where he began his exodus from Mesopotamia because of his belief in only one God, and that's when he decided to head out. And he followed down along the eastern edge of the Jordan. This later became known as the King's Highway, and it comes right down past Damascus into Shem. The wars of the Bible began with the exodus of Abraham and his clan from the city of Haran. And on leaving Haran, Abraham looks like he joined a great movement of ethnic units that kind of shook the whole Eastern Mediterranean back in the 18th century BC. Population upheavals up in Asia Minor and the regions north of Mesopotamia initiated great migrations that together with other developments, welded together heterogeneous ethnic groups like the Semites and the Horites and the Indo-Iranians among them into what is the so-called Hyksos nation, Hyksos, the Hyksos nation. And it was the Hyksos that actually conquered Egypt in the 18th century BC. A lot of people think that the pharaohs controlled the entire history of Egypt, but they didn't. This great migration of various ethnic groups that all combined into the Hyksos nation actually went down and conquered Egypt. And it was the Hyksos who conquered Egypt because they used for the first time and in great numbers a new weapon to the area. And that weapon was called the war chariot. Hence, the Hyksos were able to build their empire and rule Egypt, as well as the entire Palestinian land bridge that connected them for about 200 years. So to keep their hold over Egypt and the land of Canaan, they encouraged settlement of all these various peoples and clans in this whole area. The upheavals that were created by the Hyksos caused some unrest, and this is reflected in Abraham's life. We're not going to do it today, but if you get a chance, go and look at the book of Genesis, chapters 12 through chapter 25, and you can read about that. Abraham's military exploits and those of Isaac and Jacob all come under two categories. The first was the defense of grazing lands, the grazing rights of his clan on entering the land of Canaan, which was promised to him. And this category also included the actions taken to retrieve stolen flocks. The second category was participation in major wars, such as and that involvement was probably Abraham's obligation towards the Hyksos authorities and their Canaanite vassal petty kings that were located in the territory that Abraham decided to establish himself. Exact information is lacking, but one major war in which Abraham participated was that of the 4 kings of Mesopotamia against the 5 kings of the Dead Sea. While the northern allies, the 4 kings of Mesopotamia, while they were headed by Amraphel Shinar, they swept down the King's Highway east of the Jordan. They wanted to establish a route all the way down here to where it says Etzion Geber. That's also where the town of Eilat is, down here. And this is the Gulf of Aqaba, which would give them access to the Red Sea for trade and commerce. So that was their goal. They wanted to sweep down this area, take control of this to increase their profits more than anything else. Abraham, on the other hand, was free to move opposite direction, north, along the watershed, along the top of the hill country, and he set up an ambush just outside of Damascus and won the day. Let's see, is someone have a Bible handy? Who wants to go first? Jim, you want to go first? You'll have to unmute yourself.
We can do that.
Gotcha.
Okay.
There you go.
All right.
Genesis chapter 14.
Genesis.
Oh, I didn't see that one. Okay.
Genesis.
I'm at 43. Yep. All right. 14. Yes.
Yeah, verse 15.
Verse 15.
Genesis.
Verse 15. That would be when Abraham heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he mustered his supporters, the members of his household from birth, numbering 318, and led them in pursuit as far as Dan. He and his servants fell on them by night and defeated them, pursuing them as far as Hoab, north of Damascus. He recaptured all goods along with his kinsman, Lot, and his possessions, together with the women and people.
Okay, this was in the area of the foothills of Mount Hermon, which we talked about earlier as being snow-capped. And it was also here in a very similar outflanking movement along the same route that Abraham took that the Australian Mounted Division ambushed the Turkish Fourth Army on the night of 30 September 1918 during that war. Okay, let me show you another map. Did I share it?
Not yet.
Share screen. There we go. There we go. Jacob's migration into Egypt, and if you notice the dates here, one of the things that's hard to grasp is the timeline we're talking about. We're talking about a couple of thousand years and just the first couple of books of the Bible. But his trip down into the land of Goshen, which was a district, the eastern district of Egypt, it's understood that this took place during the Hyksos time. The king of Egypt at the time had no idea who Joseph was. He was either Amasis I or one of his successors. And he managed to kick the Hyksos out of Egypt. And then he began his reconquest of Canaan. And after this reconquest, the Hebrews that were still located down in Egypt and up in the Levant area up here, they remained an alien element suspected of sympathizing with the last Hyksos strongholds that were still in Palestine and in Syria. And they became what a 20th century military planner would call a permanent security risk. There's always been two ways to deal with a problem like this. The first was to try to induce the population to assimilate into the national host, and this was the policy that Alexander the Great followed in his eastern campaigns. The second method, the one most often used and the one most counterproductive, is to subjugate the alien elements. And the Egyptians picked this later method to deal with the Hebrews. So, Ron, you got a Bible?
Yep.
Exodus, chapter 1, verse 10. And if you have my list, I'm just going to go right down. I guess, Susan, you'll be next.
Well, I'm still into Genesis. Hold on. Okay.
Oh.
Exodus what?
Exodus chapter 1, verse 10.
Verse 10.
Looks like we lost Susan.
Yeah, and the Lord said unto Moses, go unto Pharaoh. Is that the one? For I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I might show these my signs in the midst of them, and that thou mayest tell in the ears of thy son and of thy son's ear what I have brought upon Egypt, and my signs which I have done among them. How far do you want me to go?
That's just verse 10.
It's not my verse.
So,
Yeah, that's what
the military organization of the Israelites was like that of all emerging nations that are coming out of tribal status, or based on the duty of every able-bodied male to bear arms and serve whenever necessary in his tribal contingent as part of the national host. And according to the Bible, Moses and Aaron organized the first Israelite army as they were leaving Egyptian bondage. So, Terry, you got a Bible there?
Yes. Am I unmuted? I don't know whether I'm muted or
Yes,
unmuted.
yes, you are unmuted.
Okay.
The book of Numbers.
Right. 1, 2, 3, 4. Take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel by their families, by their fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male individually, from 20 years old and above, all who are able to go to war in Israel. You and Aaron shall number them by their armies. Was it through 4? Oh, wait a minute. One more. And with you there shall be a man from every tribe, each one the head of his father's house.
Okay, what does that sound like? Does it sound familiar?
Yeah,
Draft.
Conscription.
certainly
Yeah.
does.
First of all, it was the first census, and included as part of that census was the first draft.
Yep.
So from that passage, as well as the rest of chapter 1, you can read that later, we learn that just like in the emerging Greek and the Romans and the Germanic societies, that the tribal heads were the leaders in peace as well as in war. The Israelites were donkey nomads. They moved and fought on foot, while their few heavy goods, including tools and tents, the old, the feeble, the very young, they were all carried on the backs of donkeys. And this meant that if the whole congregation moved together, including cattle, the average speed was about 3 miles per hour. So for security reasons, they would move and they would set up camp by a very fixed, regulated pattern. Even though the Israelites were exclusively foot soldiers, they didn't carry just an arbitrary assortment of weaponry according to each individual's whim. Before the Exodus, during the Exodus, and directly afterwards, typical tribal proficiencies came to be established. And in future talks together, we're going to trace the development of the Israelite army that was composed of variously armed and trained and complementary organizations that were well balanced. But from the outset, however, there had to be a fundamental organization, a basic chain of command and discipline. A lot of tribal societies never did, or only very gradually succeeded in transforming itself from a collection of clan gangs that were fighting in a mass into a force with tactical divisions and a proper chain of command. And the Bible attributes all of these accomplishments to Moses. Who's next? Who's got a Bible? Seerduck, you got a Bible?
Yes, we do.
We both do.
Okay, how about Exodus chapter 18, verse 25?
He chose capable men from all Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens.
Now, what does that sound like? To me, as a military guy, that sounds to me like brigades, battalions, companies, squads.
Organization.
Okay. The next subject we're going to get into is the Exodus itself. Let me share this with you. Now you can go on Google. There's YouTube videos. There's all kinds of commentary out there from so-called experts, professors, biblical scholars. They're all trying to define what they think was the route of the Exodus and the crossing of the Red Sea. The truth is, nobody really knows where the Red Sea crossing actually occurred. Nobody knows. There's lots of theories out there. I'm going to present to you today another theory that, from a military perspective, seems extremely plausible. But again, nobody knows for sure. So I'm very much tempted to follow the former British governor of the Sinai, Major Jarvis, in identifying a narrow tongue of land between the Mediterranean. Let me zoom in here. You see where I'm pointing here? This extremely narrow tongue of land between the Mediterranean Sea and this brackish lagoon called the Serbonian Sea, which is halfway between Port Said. Port Said is here where the Suez Canal comes out, and El Arish, which is here by the river of Egypt, as the site of the encounter between the Israelites and the Egyptians that were chasing them down. Major Jarvis was here when he was suddenly caught in a gale while standing on the wet sand, and completely swept by the angry waters of the Mediterranean across that narrow tongue. And that convinced him at that time, wow, this is where I think the crossing of the Red Sea occurred. Um, I was talking to someone who's well versed in ancient Jewish history, and he was telling me that the word for the Red Sea, if it's translated, actually means the Reed Sea. And if you notice here, it's even depicted as the way of the wilderness of the Reed Sea, and they referred to this as the Reed Sea. And his thinking was, you know, this is very marshy area through here. There's lots of reeds through here. So it may have gotten lost in translation. Um, the identification of this particular area is even more tempting because there were two similar occurrences that were recorded as having taken place in this exact same spot between the sea and the lagoon. The first was in the 1st century BC when the Emperor Xerxes, the Persian Emperor Xerxes, was invading Egypt in 340 BC. Part of his troops drowned there. And Strabo was writing about the same period. He says, quote, during my stay at Alexandria in Egypt, the sea rose so high near Pelusium and Mount Cassius, which is located right in the center here of the sandbar, as to overflow the land and convert the mountain into an island. So if this is true, Moses then kind of set the example for all the future Israelite commanders to minimize their adversaries' superiority by making the geographic features of the theater of war work to their advantage. So imagine this. They've been enslaved for hundreds of years. They're leaving Egypt, finally. They're carrying whatever they can with them. Probably not a whole lot of weaponry, no armor, no chariots. So how could they even hope to defeat a pursuing Egyptian army that's heavily armed, well trained, and with the dreaded war chariots? Well, if you march onto this sandbar, which is barely wide enough for a two-lane road, a narrow two-lane road with very soft sand on both sides, a front of 300 chariots would be reduced down to a front of maybe 2, 3, or 4 at the most. So it wouldn't take a whole lot of lightly armed Israeli tribes individuals to hold off a couple of chariots, while the thousands of Egyptians are all piled up behind them and they can't move. So that's one of the theories. Um, Archaeological investigation also established the fact that during the time of the Exodus, the strongholds along this sea route were very sparsely or not manned at all, including Cassius in the center. But the main road coming out of the land of Goshen, along this route, all of these outposts, road posts, were all heavily guarded because that's where all the main water sources were. And of course, Moses knew this. So it seems likely that I'm going to avoid this route and I'm going to take the sea route. And it turned out that this may have been the advantage he was seeking. I hope I didn't blow your image of Charlton Heston standing on the big rock with his arms outstretched, you know, because that's still my favorite version of the Red Sea. But from a practical military standpoint, of all the theories out there, this one does kind of make some sense. But much like the Exodus, the stages of the conquest of Canaan, up. Let me blow this back up. Much of the conquest is shrouded in mystery. The Bible was not interested in military affairs per se, nor did the chroniclers who compiled the historical reports of the conquest of Canaan, as told in the books of Joshua and Judges. They made really no attempt to check their sources. You have to remember that these books were written thousands of years after the fact. I think I got one more map to share with you. Yep. Consequently, there's all kinds of divergent, conflicting versions of the course of the conquest, and modern research hasn't been able to figure out what it was. But nonetheless, the view that's held by most of them is that the conquest of the land of Canaan took place in stages. The first stage was the exodus from Egypt. The second stage was the 40-year migration in the Sinai. The third stage was the invasion of Transjordan and the occupation of parts of Moab up here, and Gilead even further north. Number 4 was the conquest of the Central Mountain Massif by Joshua, and then the conquest of southern Canaan and the northern part of the Negev desert by tribal penetration both southwards from the Central Mountain Massif and northwards through the Negev. 6, which probably occurred about the same time as 5, was the conquest of Galilee, which is off the map to the north, up there. We lack precise information on the initial entry into Transjordan, but there is a most interesting account of one of the major events that took place during the planning stage. One of the most important staff functions from the first days of primitive tribal wars onwards has been military intelligence. Wellington put this major mental effort very succinctly when he was asked what was he thinking of during his long hours of seclusion and silent ponderings, and he answered, "I'm thinking about the other side of the hill." Well, the other side of the hill to Moses was the land of Canaan across the wilderness of the Negev. To him, that was the other side of the hill. To find out how best to go about conquering it, Moses sent out 12 spies, and the book of Numbers, chapter 13, records the briefing that Moses gave his reconnaissance troops. Now, 12 tribes is pretty obvious. It's because the 12 spies, because there were 12 tribes. The subject matter of strategic intelligence can be considered from two aspects. Number 1, the capabilities of nations, and number 2, the intentions of the nations. And Moses was clearly concerned about the first. What's the capabilities of the nations? And to give you sort of a modern description of what that is, the capabilities of a nation in war and peace are based on their natural and industrial resources, their political stability and demography, the character and stamina of their populations, the armed forces, their scientific endeavor, and their topography and infrastructure. Now, when you compare what that modern description that I just gave you to what Moses was said 3,000 years earlier, it's amazing how dead on he was. So let's see, who's up next? Jim, I guess you're back to you. If you could read Numbers
13.
when you unmute. Say again?
It'll be 13.
Yeah, you need to unmute yourself there, Jim.
I can do that.
Okay,
So,
Numbers 13.
Yep. You want the Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, send out men?
Numbers 13, verses 17 through 20.
No, that's it. Moses sent them to reconnoiter the land of Canaan. Go up into Negev and then go into the highlands. See what sort of country it is and what sort of people the inhabitants are, whether they are strong or weak, few or many, what sort of country they live in, whether it is good or poor, what sort of towns they have, whether they are open or fortified, what sort of land is it, fertile or barren, wooded or open. Be bold and bring back some of the produce of the country.
Okay, excellent. So one of the weaknesses and potential failings of an intelligence report has always been the fact that the recipient must base his planning and action on the estimates and the interpretations of others. And others might arrive at conclusions different from those of the commander would have deduced had the commander been able to take a personal look at the other side of the hill. Frederick the Great's defeat at Kunersdorf in 1759, Napoleon's retreat before Acre in 1799, the British disaster at Arnhem in A Bridge Too Far in 1944 probably would not have occurred had the commanders-in-chief been able to assess for themselves the facts on which their intelligence was based. So it's only natural that commanders have always impressed upon their intelligence gathering agencies the need to provide them with as much tangible proof as possible to confirm their reports. And Moses was no exception. So Jim, if you go back and read that last verse again, verse 20. When you're unmuted.
When I'm unmuted. I'm going to tap my button here, my space bar. What sort of country they live in, whether it's good or poor, what sort of towns they have, whether they are open or fortified, what sort of land it is, fertile or barren, wooded or open. Be bold and bring back some of the produce of the country. Was the season for early grapes. I think that's a neat part.
Yeah, that's the tangible proof that he was looking for. So the spies heeded Moses, and they substantiated the reports by bringing back natural products of Canaan, carrying with them samples of the rich fruits that grew there. And that evidence did a whole lot to add credibility to the items in their report, which tangible proof couldn't be obtained. Another means of minimizing danger and basing one's estimates on the appreciations of others has always been to choose the most capable officers for crucial missions. In the 17th century, when it became customary to accredit ambassadors as permanent gatherers of intelligence at foreign courts, the French handbook stressed the importance of choosing generals of the highest caliber. And Moses had already acted accordingly in his own day. Yes. In this way, the more optimistic appraisal of Joshua and Caleb was effectively overruled by the voices of the 10 other scouts, representing the highest leaderships in their clan. Go away. Their evaluation was sustained when an attempt to push straight north from, this is the oasis at Kadesh Barnea, and when he attempted, based on the reports, to push directly north, they got as far as Hormah, which was a walled city, and they were promptly defeated and repelled and had to retreat back. The tribal warriors were not capable of breaching the walls of the cities in the Beersheba Valley, and they were certainly not able to stand up in open country to heavily armed regulars who probably included units of the war chariot. So the scouts were vindicated, and Moses therefore changed his plan from a direct for a more indirect approach by a great detour that you see here to go up into Transjordan. Now, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Amorites, all of these are basically kinsmen of the Israeli tribes. But when Abraham asked the king of Edom, hey, I'm going to be going up into Moab. Would it be okay with you if I cross over your territory to get to the King's Highway? Here it says the way of the wilderness, but it's actually the King's Highway. Is it okay if I cross over and head north? And the king of Edom said, no way. So he had to make a big detour all the way around. And then when he got up here, where his kinsmen were, Sihon was a new king who had just recently conquered this area in the lowlands of Gilead, particularly north of the Arnon River right here. But he had only recently been able to capture the area and at great cost, and he didn't yet have time to fortify the area. So the Israelites were able to invade and conquer Sihon's territory and pushed out there northwards into Gilead, which was only sparsely settled at the time. And there they linked up with some local Hebrew clans, and they forged a rather loose tribal structure into a semi-sedentary society of militant tribes, and with the goal of one day capturing all of Canaan. So that sets the scene. That's setting the scene. Like I said, sorry for this first one being a little bit lengthy, but the whole idea was to give you some perspective geographically and chronologically. We're talking, we've already covered a couple of thousand years from when Abraham left Mesopotamia until Joshua arrives in Transjordan to begin the conquest of Canaan, which is where we'll pick up next week. We'll pick up with Joshua's battles.